Thank you guys for all joining in today as we kind of roll through this presentation. I know I'm excited to get back out on the road and see many of you soon. I'm excited to see a lot of familiar names here. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Katie Berger. I am with Madden Media here. I'm a director of destination strategy here on the team, so representing the Mid-Atlantic and East Coast region. And today we're going to roll through this presentation that Matt has, kind of is going to talk about destination intelligence, some overarching tactics and strategies for that world, but then kind of looking at some of the tools that we're using here at Madden and in our world here in 2021. Special thanks to Heidi and the PRLA team for hosting us today and opening up this group. We are recording this session, so we'll have the recording available for anyone that wants to share it with their team or look back on it after the fact. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can feel free to drop them in the chat or just let us know as we're going through. Otherwise, please keep your mics muted so that we don't have any feedback or anything like that. And I think that's all the housekeeping stuff I have. So I'm going to officially turn it over to Matt Clement, who is a managing partner here at Madden.
Well, good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And thanks for making time out of your day. I know that at this point in our COVID journeys, that anyone who shows up to a webinar is either a warrior or being kind, or hopefully interested in the topic of the day. And I'm going to do my best to make this a worthwhile 45 minutes or so for you. And again, thanks for being here. So we're going to talk today about destination intelligence. And, you know, I think this is a buzzword that has really kind of taken flight in the last year. And, you know, as we talk about destination intelligence, I think that we have to, you know, also talk about metrics. And, you know, as the title of the session, you know, indicated, we're going to talk about how it's all about strategy, not the metrics necessarily. But to kick this off, let's talk about this. How many metrics do you successfully need to rule the world? Or maybe, you know, just to be a data-driven DMO? And the truth of the matter is, it's as few as it takes. And this is important because we're living in the golden age of data. And I think a lot of us in the DMO side, and I know we have a few folks with us today that are not necessarily with DMOs. So even in your own businesses, in the tourism industry, we really have gone from a period of time, even just as recently as 10 years ago, where it was very hard to understand who our visitors were and who was arriving, what they were doing, how our marketing was impacting that, to where we are at in 2021, where now we have really more metrics, more data than most of us know what to do with. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about metrics and how to develop a plan for deciding what data streams and what metrics do we need and what do we not. And so really that all centers around destination intelligence. And again, this is a buzzword. This has come out a lot in the last, just year or so, as more people were kind of running into the same roadblock. And this is even before COVID, which was, okay, I've got 15 different, and even in the case of one of my friends down in Memphis, Ashley McHugh, who runs research programs for Memphis, Tennessee, she has 35 different research and data vendors. And it's like, what do I do with all this? How do I get to the end of my fiscal year and I'm looking at all the line items in my budget and not have a sad face about some of the investments I've made, and realizing that I didn't use them as much as I wanted to, or I didn't feel like I got the full value. And a lot of people were running into that before COVID. And the answer was, well, I'm going to hire a data analyst. I'm going to hire a data scientist. But that's really, that for a lot of folks, that really wasn't realistic to take on $75,000, $80,000 salary, in some cases more, for that type of talent and adding that to your staff. And then after COVID, it became even less of a reality for even the larger CVB organizations or DMO organizations. And so destination intelligence, I think, came about as an idea of how do we pull all of this together in some sort of intelligent way that helps us with our business and helps us with, addressing the fact that we have so many different data streams and not necessarily enough people to utilize it fully. It means different things to different organizations, I'll tell you. For some organizations, it's a lot like the dashboard on your car, where it's telling, the idea is to have some sort of flow of information that tells you when something's wrong, or, when your engine's over revved or the check engine light comes on and something's actually amiss. For other folks, it's about where to invest, so it just as we have all of these stock apps to tell us, whether or not it's time to invest in Bitcoin or invest in Tesla. We also have information flowing into our organizations that can help tell us, where an origin market is ready to be invested in or not. And then for some other folks, it's a fantasy baseball draft guide in a lot of ways, which today is appropriate here on opening day, about just helping us pick our partners or the players for our fantasy team. So talking about how we think about building our media teams and the partners and the different organizations that we work with and the different strategies that we want to employ through our own seasons, throughout the year. But here's what it's, kind of, at least from my perspective, where it started, for me, in a lot of ways, this is going back to when I worked in Visit Fort Worth a few years back. For me, it was all about just combining different data points together to give me a better sense of how to, in this particular example, just to evaluate the value of a couple different origin markets. So I could look at, how many impressions I had to spend to get an arrival, what these expected ADRs were for travelers coming from these markets, how long they might stay and how much they might spend. So this is kind of, from my own personal perspective, where it all kind of started for me. And it's come a long way since then, I think. But here's what I think from a larger kind of grand scale, it should be. It should streamline strategic thinking, and it needs to be aligned to key business questions. And we're going to talk about formulating key business questions here in just a minute. It should not be about cramming as many metrics into a dashboard as you can. And I know that there is that temptation. If you have ever worked in a business intelligence platform like Tableau, it is very, very easy, or even Google Analytics, and I'm sure most of you work in Google Analytics, then you know what I'm talking about. It can be really, really tempting to have every possible chart turned on, but that's not what destination intelligence is necessarily about. It should be actionable. It should be collaborative in nature, and it should improve your situational awareness when you're thinking about the framework for your own destination intelligence. It should not cause paralysis by analysis. And again, going back to saying how many metrics and graphs and things can I stick into my Google Analytics or into any other platforms that I'm using? What oftentimes happens is you're looking at all that, your brain just shuts down. To say nothing about kind of, trying to go out to your boards or your community stakeholders or to your business partners and trying to explain it to them. It should be accessible. It should be easily communicated. It should be transparent. And this is something that's not always easy in the world of destination marketing or in tourism, and trying to communicate or to share information that we're gathering and how it relates to our own marketing activities or to the marketing activities of our partners. But however, it does not need to require a degree in data science. It does not need you should not need a team of analysts that you have to pay a ton of money by the hour to translate all this for you. So, depending on what your needs are, what I hope you'll find out today is, as you go through some of these steps that we're going to talk about, that you'll realize that goes back to what to Einstein. He said, make it as simple as possible and no simpler. And that's the same thing when you're thinking about destination intelligence, or you could even broaden this a bit to say tourism intelligence. We're not building rocket ships here. And there is a push, I think, in our industry in the last, several years to make it seem like it has to be more complicated than it really is. And so we're going to talk about that today and try to help you avoid some of those icebergs where it gets so complicated that you really do start to feel almost hopeless or helpless. Like, I got to go out and hire, this data scientist person just to help me make sense of any of this. It should be able to scale to the needs of your organization, and it should help expand its value to the community. Now, I will admit that this particular statement is geared towards those of you on the call today from DMOs. But what I mean by this is something that I saw a lot, having worked, over the last 5 years at a couple of different data providers before joining the team here at Madden, was that I would talk to a lot of very small destinations who felt overwhelmed by the number of options out there, and they were just racking their brains saying, well, how do I afford this $150,000 worth of information that all of these various vendors are telling me that I need? The fact of the matter is that, what you need at your DMO or your tourism organization is probably not necessarily going to be as complex or as expensive as what a big organization like Disney needs. So it's going to need to scale to the needs of your organization. It needs to be realistic. For a lot of you on the call today, that are maybe taking your first steps into putting research and data into your budget and creating line items, you don't necessarily need to answer every question in the world in year one. It might just be as simple as starting out with where people are coming from and what they're doing while they're here and who can help me understand that, and then building from there. It does not need to require Tony Stark's budget to implement. And this is, like I said, the same thing that I ran into often with destinations feeling overwhelmed, that they would have so many conversations and then start tallying up how much everything costs and just sort of shutting down and saying, well, it's just too expensive for us and we're just not going to do anything. Destination intelligence does not necessarily automatically mean a high price tag. So I've tried to lay out kind of what it is and what it's not, but let's talk about how we build a foundation for destination intelligence. And I will tell you that the idea of destination intelligence is not necessarily attached to any one product that you need to rush out and buy. Certainly, there are companies like Madden where we do have a platform that helps with this, but I want to make the point here and now that when I talk about destination intelligence, really what I'm thinking or trying to show you today is a way of thinking about the data that you're bringing in, the challenges that you're facing, how to go about addressing, just really simply put, the needs that you have and assessing that. And then, not necessarily having to go out and buy a platform, a business intelligence platform or otherwise, but even just to understand how to evaluate different data, whether those are vendors or providers, or even if you're looking at your Google Analytics board and trying to understand what is there that's important to you and what's not. All of that begins with the development of key business questions. And I'll tell you, I sourced a lot of what you're going to see today from things that I've read over the years and learned a lot from myself, from publications like the Harvard Business Review, which is one of my favorite publications, highly recommended to everyone if you're not already a subscriber to it. It's a great investment. So key business questions, what am I talking about? Well, key business questions are really about how to frame your business challenges and understanding at the end of it what the metrics and data and research needs are that are going to help you solve the questions that we're going to go through here. So step one is to define your purpose. You need to be able to zero in on whatever challenge or problem that you are trying to solve. And this is going to be, and I'll speak to the DMO side of things, very, very different from one DMO to the next. What the folks at the Philadelphia CVB, their challenges and the problems that they're trying to figure out are going to look quite different than Gettysburg. And from one to the next, the team over in the Poconos are going to have a very different set of challenges as a regional DMO than the folks in the Lehigh Valley. Well, actually, those are both kind of regional, but you get my point. And so you need to think about what it is that you're trying to do. Are you trying to figure out how to solve an over tourism problem, which isn't as big of a deal right now everywhere, but there are places even in 2021 that are starting to have to think about it from a COVID perspective. How much tourism can we handle during the hopefully last remaining months of this pandemic? For others, it's just how do we go from a destination that was very business travel dependent to one that we need to welcome day trippers, people that we didn't pay as much attention to. And I've tried to give you an example of this down below, and we'll work through these examples as we go through these key business questions. So in my example, I say, hey, we need to restart our local visitor economy with an emphasis on total visitor spend. We want to accomplish this by increasing visitation from our regional drive markets, which is an untapped resource because historically we had an emphasis on room night generation, and now we just need feet on streets uh, in addition to heads and beds. So that example is just to give you an idea of how you might work with your team to write essentially a mission statement, define the purpose. What is it you're trying to do? And you might have several of these, and that's okay. And you can go through each of those questions from here on, or just zero in on the one that you feel is the most pertinent for today. Step 2 is to immerse yourself in the data. So you want to conduct a comprehensive survey of everything you already know to be true, but with a forward-looking mindset. So what are the facts and which of those facts are actually important? So you're going to take a look at all the information that you currently have on hand. And in our example here, we're going to say, well, look, we know drive market visitors have historically been not really looked highly upon, and we haven't marketed to them. And we know from previous visitor profile studies or economic impact reporting that we've done that 20% of our visitors are from less than 100 miles away, and they spend $75 on average per person. And we also know now that more people are taking staycations. We know that drive market visitors have historically been day trippers and they haven't converted to overnight stays. And they're also not frequent visitors to our website. So we want to look at what the facts are and what facts are important, and we want to kind of reverse some of that. So in other words, we say that, hey, we know that dry market visitors, are typically day trippers, but we want to also ask ourselves, what are drive market visitors not? Well, they're not frequent visitors to our website, and as a lot of us know, when we get people to visit our websites, we can oftentimes influence a longer length of stay. So when I say immerse yourself in the data, I don't mean go out immediately and buy a whole bunch of it to take a bath in, but rather take stock of all of the information you currently have on hand and really take a hard look at what you know and what of the things that you know, what are important as you move forward and look forward into the recovery phase of this COVID pandemic. So step 3 is to generate your key business questions. So using the purpose, defining language that we established in step 1, that mission statement, now we want to ask as many questions internally and for DMOs on the call, externally as well. You want to include your local stakeholders and business owners. And you want to say, okay, we want to move from what do we want to achieve to what do we need now to actually achieve it. And an example of that is to say, hey, can we target drive market consumers most likely to spend the night? And if we were going to do that, what would be the channels that are most efficient for doing that? And what activities do our drive market visitors frequent? What are they doing when they come to town? What is the expected ROI from this? Why would drive market visitors not visit our town? Why would they not spend the night? So it kind of goes back to what I said in step 2. You want to take some of these questions and invert them a little bit. And so as you ask yourself these questions, this is really going to help guide your hand about what data sources are going to help you, what you want to have in your destination intelligence toolkit. And it'll also kind of start to help you understand as you're evaluating data sources and providers and different types of information, what ultimately is not going to help you. And then finally, you have probably the most important part is to prioritize those key business questions. So as I mentioned, you're going to, have maybe multiple mission statements or multiple, in that step 1 kind of evaluating your purpose. And there's a good chance that you're going to end up with a lot of key business questions. And what you really have to do is ask yourself, what of these KBQs, as I'm going to kind of shorthand now say, are actionable? And what are pipe dreams? What are going to lead to incremental improvement or the status quo? What are not actually going to do anything? And this is important, especially for DMOs, because oftentimes we get caught up and coming up with these grand ideas where the data simply doesn't exist, or there's no clear path for us to influence. So let me give you an example. If you are a small, more rural DMO, and you say, well, my key business question is how can we influence, additional flights to Pittsburgh's airport? Well, the fact of the matter is, it might not be a clear path for you to impact something like that. Or if you're, again, a small regional DMO, and the question is how can we get more Chinese travelers to come to our destination in 2021? Well, right now you can't control that because they can't even get to the U.S. For tourism purposes. So a couple of obvious examples there, but generally what you want to do is take your key KBQs and organize them according to that chart that you see on the right side of your screen. You want to think about what are the pipe dreams, what are curiosities. So, what are and curiosities, I think, is where a lot of us have gotten stuck in the mud, and myself included during my own DMO career. So, what are the inconsequential pursuits that don't really have a clear path to any sort of activation? And then finally, you have kind of where you want to go, which is what are my high value KBQs? What are the opportunities for deriving significant business value from analytics, from the data? Is there a way for me to subscribe to different data sets where I can learn about my day trippers and where they're going? What zip codes are they coming from and how would I target them? And then incremental improvements, which are easily executable, but low impact actions that are still maybe worth looking at scale. And a lot of times this can be, looking for, and certainly worthwhile looking at how do I automate certain reports or make them more easily communicated, that sort of thing. Are you looking at short-term rental, for instance, and is that something that's important in your destination? And, if I could, cheaply and from a cost efficient standpoint, bring in short-term rental data, would that help my community? Would it help my cause, in terms of telling the story of what we're trying to do or what we're trying to influence, showing things like that growing over time. So that is the 4 steps to key business questions. And certainly there is a lot of information online in addition to today's presentation, which Katie will make available to everybody. But this can really help set you up for moving forward with thinking about the types of data that you want to buy into, or how you want to frame your own destination intelligence mindset. Okay, so with all of that, what about metrics? And I've kind of been, probably it sounds pretty down on metrics so far, but they're not all evil by any means. But there are some things that we need to think about, with individual metrics. There's really 3 key attributes for determining if a metric's going to be useful for destination intelligence for your toolkit. And anything that you're looking at, any metric that you're looking at, really needs to pass this test. So a metric is generally useful if it follows the 3 A's. The first is it actionable? Does a metric enable quick decision making? 2 is it accessible? Is the metric able to be widely communicated and understood? Now, this is a lesson that I learned early on in my career as a part of the marketing team for Visit Fort Worth, Texas. And namely, that was that I had come up with some super complex marketing mumbo jumbo that I thought was really impressive about, how we were doing. And when I put it on screen in front of our board, it was crickets because none of them really understood what I was talking about. And so you really want to think about, is the metric accessible? Is it something that, is going to be understood and is going to be accepted, not just by you or by your staff, but by your stakeholders and your board and those external decision makers that ultimately we're all accountable to. Then finally, is it auditable? Is the metric transparent? Is it credible both internally and externally? And this has become, this is a long-standing issue with a lot of our media folks. We have to really think about very hard that if we come out with a 350 to 1 ROI on our media buy, as great as that sounds, we need to make sure that the data that's driving a metric like that, where we say, hey, for every dollar of media we spend, we get $350 of economic impact. It's not saying that you toss that out, but you really need to understand all the data that goes behind that and whether or not it is credible and if the methodology is sound. If it's not, it's simply not worth it. And I think a lot of DMOs over the years have learned this the hard way, and have really given themselves some headaches when that one person on your board, or maybe two people on your board, really start to call you out for some of those metrics that may seem self-serving to folks that we're talking to, external folks outside of the organization. So make sure that all the metrics that you're thinking about are actionable, accessible, and auditable. There's a couple other things to consider. Metrics are not just for sales and marketing. Things like operational metrics are becoming more critical. How do we measure the productivity of our staff? And how do we measure how long it takes for us to produce a project or the work that we're doing? So this is becoming more important, especially in this day and age where a lot of you are probably operating on with a smaller staff than you were a year or two ago. So operational metrics are becoming important, and there's lots of others out there in the world, especially for those of you that are an executive director or CEO level. And again, I really highly recommend, especially for those of you in leadership roles, to really take a hard look at things like Harvard Business Review. They give you so much of this. Finally, not finally, but in the middle here, don't let numbers hijack your strategy. Even here in this golden age of data, there's a lot of room for your gut to still operate, for you to know based on how long you've been in your position and an understanding, an innate understanding of your destination. There's still room for intuition and common sense. I'll give you a baseball example. For all of the work or the change that Moneyball brought about, and hopefully everybody here knows about Moneyball, but long story short, it was a book about the big change in baseball from the old baseball scouts that would look at a player and look at his physique and how he swung a bat to determine how good of a player he would be, to a much more data-focused approach. Well, here in 2021, I'll tell you, yes, baseball, the sport of baseball, is absolutely 100% more data-driven than ever. But there are still baseball scouts that if you go to a college baseball game, they're going to be right down there with their radar gun. They're still employed. And that's because baseball teams understand, just as we should, that there's still room for a human element in all of this discussion. Finally, don't let preconceptions rule or a single metric dominate. You want to avoid what I call metric isolation, and then another term called surrogation when you're plotting your destination strategy. And these last two are really worth talking about a little bit more here. What exactly is metric isolation and surrogation? Because I know these are terms that you might not be familiar with, but they're extremely important as we think about how metrics drive our strategy, or really should not be driving our strategy. Metric isolation. Now, here's a really long explanation, and I will tell you that the idea here came from a fantastic article that you can read online for free by a couple of gentlemen named Bert DeLange and Philip Fernbach. And it was an article called The Dangers of Categorical Thinking. It's a fantastic article that I highly recommend that you check out. And again, you can Google this and read it for free online. And in that article, they talk about the fact that your mind is a categorization machine. It's busy all the time taking in all this data that's usually not very organized, and then simplifying and structuring it so that you can actually make sense of the world. And it's one of the most important capabilities of our brains, because when we're walking through the woods, we need to be able at a glance to say, that's a snake or that's a stick, and then take the actions that are appropriate depending on what we've identified. But unfortunately, that also carries over into everything else that we do in life. And so for me, as I read that and I read the rest of the article, I realized that for tourism, It's really about metric isolation. What do I mean by that? Well, here is Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the 70s when he was Mr. Universe. And I will tell you right now, after a year of COVID, I wasn't close to that before COVID, and I'm even further away from it now. But I want you guys to think about this for a second. Can you guess what Arnold Schwarzenegger's BMI was? So if you don't know what BMI is, it's body mass index. So a lot of you are probably familiar with it, but long story short, it is a single number that essentially identifies if you are underweight, average, right where you're supposed to be, overweight, or obese. And it's all based on a single number that is out there. So, can you guess what his BMI was during the height of his bodybuilding career? Well, it was 31. And if he stepped on my bathroom weight scale, which also tells me what my BMI is each day, it would tell him that he was obese, and then he needed to lose weight. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think he looked very obese in that particular picture. But here's the problem: if we isolated just on Arnold's BMI, it would be awfully misleading, right? So if we ignored what we saw in the mirror, if we ignored all of our other statistics, our metrics about Arnold's physique, then we would, incorrectly decide that we needed to put Arnold on a diet. And that's not at all what he needed to do at that point. So the tip here is don't let your data stand alone. Always relate it to other sources of information to help provide useful context and a better strategy. And I'll give you a practical example here. From the DMO perspective, I used to work with clients during my days working at Arrivalist, where they would be doing campaigns in places like New York City or Philadelphia or Dallas. And they would notice that they were seeing way lower engagement or worse arrivals per thousand impressions performance. So looking at how many people arrive in their market for every 1,000 impressions that they were spending. And they would say, oh my gosh, like when I go into Dallas, all my metrics are so much worse. Or when I'm tapping into a brand new market, my click-through rate's terrible. And they would incorrectly decide to cancel out those programs because their click-through rate was too low, or they weren't seeing other engagement metrics that they were used to seeing in more established markets. And just like if we focused on Arnold having a BMI of 31 and saying, oh my God, Arnold, yeah, you look incredible, but you're obese, man. You got to go on a diet. It's the incorrect strategy. And so by putting in other metrics alongside some of that, we can make a better decision. So in other words, when we look at that Dallas performance and then come to realize that, well, historically, we're trying to tap into a new market. And not only that, but people from this market spend 3 times on average and stay twice as long as our normal traveler. And that's why we're trying to do this. Then it can be a much better context for what we're trying to do. Surrogation, on the other hand, is an even worse thing, really. And it's the mental tendency to replace our strategy with metrics or a number. And this comes from another HBR article from Michael Harris and Bill Taylor called Don't Let Metrics Undermine Your Business. And it was really centered around a particular case study, that of Wells Fargo. So many of you probably remember this. Wells Fargo got into quite a bit of trouble just a few years back when they created a metric that essentially incentivized and penalized their workers to get people to sign up for as many accounts at Wells Fargo as possible. And this led to a raft of problems. So they started to focus on only one main thing, and that was for each client, we want them to have an X number of accounts with Wells Fargo. We want them to have a retirement account, a mortgage, 2 loans, a checking account, a savings account, and so forth. Well, they said that was their strategy. They wanted to have a strategy of having clients as tied into the Wells Fargo system as possible, but they created a metric that completely overran that strategy. And it replaced the strategy in the end, and it really led to a major problem, namely that they had people at their organization at the bank doing fraudulent activities and signing people up for accounts they didn't ask for. And as you can see, and probably remember, it didn't end well for Wells Fargo, and to this day, it still haunts them. here in the DMO industry, we don't have quite as dramatic of an example, but in some regards, we have one that's been pretty damaging for us as well. And what that is, and it's not just room nights. We have an over reliance on things like click through rate as well, and just discussed where that can lead to problems if you're not layering it with other data streams. But the pandemic really revealed that we were over reliant on the room night as a dominant metric for us, and where that became a problem, especially for those that were more dependent upon business travel, is that we were left looking at, how do we prove our value? How do we show our value beyond just the room nights? How do we show our value, or how do we impact things like local business, and getting feet on streets? And how do we go through a period like this when our hotel occupancy taxes are down, and we're trying to figure out how to maintain a relevancy to our communities? So very much the same thing, where we really became, our strategies became surrogates to one particular metric, in this case, the room night. And it's not to say that the room night's not important. Of course, it totally is. We shouldn't throw any metric or measurement completely out the window. Room nights and click-through rate are still always going to matter. They're always going to be important. But we do need to think about their place in our strategies. And as we think about destination intelligence, we need to consider how these fit in, and how, what are the other points of value that we have that we should be communicating and elevating in terms of their status and then their importance to us. So how do we address metric surrogation in tourism? Well, first and foremost, you go back through those KBQs, the key business questions, and find multiple metrics that can measure success or help you define a solution. Now, you don't want to start with the metrics. You want to start with what your challenges are. You want to start there first. You want to start with your KBQs, then find the metrics that are going to help you. And you don't want to just focus on one. You want to focus on multiple metrics that are going to help. You want to diversify the community stakeholders that you're bringing to the table, especially when you're talking about strategic direction or performance metrics. And we're seeing a lot of this year in our industry, where more than ever, DMOs are having great conversations with the chambers of commerce, with local business owners, in addition to their hotel partners. And this has really helped them to reestablish what the value is of certain types of visitors, for instance, day trippers, that were really kind of historically either looked down upon or outright ignored. Next, we want to consider new models of holistic measurement. So one of the favorites of ours here at Madden is a theory called collective impact. And I'll talk about that more here in just a second. But anything that really includes things like total visitor spend, resident sentiment, especially for smaller rural destinations. A lot of rural destinations, outdoor meccas and outdoor destinations, they're being overrun right now. They're seeing resident sentiment tanking. And so they're really having to rethink about how do we target? How do we show our value? It's not good enough if we're an outdoor destination or a small rural destination that's, feeling overrun. It's not enough to say we had, 30% more people here this year than last year. It becomes more important to understand what types of visitors are coming in, what they mean for the local economy, what it means for resident quality of life, and so forth. And then other things are, important as well, like wide scale indicators for economic participation. So, how are we growing our entire economy? How does tourism affect business relocations or people moving to our cities that we want to have as a part of our communities? And then finally, make sure that you're reviewing how your staff and your teams are incentivized. Are the personal goals of your teams in alignment with the organization's new goals, or the goals that you have established? Are they overly dependent on a single or small group of metrics? And I'll give you an example. In my career, one of the things that I used to really just gnash my teeth about the most was the room night goal for leisure. And it was a pretty easy goal to game, I guess you could say. You would simply go out and You would find a media provider who is a part of that end game report would say, here's how many leisure nights you influenced. And it really wasn't a great, if you go back to whether or not it was auditable, a lot of that would have probably had a hard time passing muster if someone really dug deep into it. But because it was a goal, it was very much a part of how I thought about my job and about what I wanted, what types of media I wanted to buy, what types of partners I wanted to work with. And I'm not saying that any particular partners that provide that type of information are bad, simply that we don't want to be incentivized too heavily on a single goal rather than a series of goals that are dependent upon more than just a single metric. So hopefully that makes sense. And I will tell you, again, a supporting article of all of this is that article, Don't Let Metrics Undermine Your Business. And this was by Michael Harris and Bill Taylor in the HBR. Okay, so here we are with a few more minutes to go. You've gone this far, and I congratulate you. I hope you've been able to take some good notes out of this, or not take notes, because we're going to provide you this deck. So I hope you've learned something new so far. But let's just kind of wrap up here with a few things. First, I've talked about immerse yourself in the data. What are the metrics that you're currently bringing in? And I wanted to show you exactly what I meant by that. So you want to take stock of your current metrics. And it's funny because in doing this, I think a lot of us in the DMO world, and even here on the agency side, surprise ourselves by just how many metrics we're actually paying attention to and currently bringing in. And so this is a great example from a good friend of mine, Wendy Keel. She was formerly with the Discover Los Angeles crew, and now is a part of tourism economics and the Symphony platform, which is based there actually in your state in Philadelphia with the great Adam Sachs. And of course, Eric, formerly with the Philadelphia CVB. And Wendy had this great chart here where they did just that. They looked at all of the different metrics they were looking at in their travel conversion funnel, their marketing funnel. And I highly recommend that you do something similar. It's really, really handy to understand all the different things that you're bringing in and then start to take stock of those metrics and start to identify maybe where there are holes. Are you not necessarily, are you not currently subscribing or looking at anything that informs you on that lower mid funnel, for instance, or in that lower funnel? Next, consider long-term strategic concepts like collective impact and what metrics might be worth adding to support it. As I said, here at Madden, we're a very big proponent and big fan of the collective impact theory. And this is all derived from a white paper that was produced in the Stanford or produced for the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And if you look up collective impact, you're going to find a lot of information about it. I think that this is probably one of the best examples of how we really want to think in the DMO industry going forward out of the pandemic. How are we influencing not just putting heads in beds or even just feet on streets, but how does it all work together? How does a visit lead to someone wanting to live in our communities and work in our communities and invest in those communities? And by doing all of that, making it that much more attractive for investment by businesses or attractions. So collective impact is a great way to think. There are plenty of other frameworks out there that you can consider when thinking about destination intelligence and what it means to you. Finally, how are you learning from your competition and are you benchmarking against them at all? Certainly here at Madden, this is something that we've begun to pay a lot more attention to. And looking at when our clients, competitors are actively marketing and at what times of the year, and what sorts of creative that they're using, but also benchmarking visitation and trying to understand when different people are coming in to our competitors' destinations versus ours and what that means to us. So are you learning from your competition? And sometimes that can be just as simple as going and browsing websites and looking at competitor websites and seeing sort of what they're up to and what they're doing, where their minds are. Some suggestions for your foundation. So we've talked about KBQs. We've talked about some things to look out for with metrics in terms of, how do we determine if a metric's really useful? We talked about surrogation and metric isolation. But always I get asked, okay, if I'm going to build a base of intelligence for my organization, what are some key players? What are some must-haves? And so this is my list. And I will say that it is a bit of my own opinion. And I certainly can't list everything out here, but I think this is a good bedrock. So first and foremost, location data. In 2021, location data has become more accessible than ever. It has become much more affordable than ever. There's multiple good providers out there. You have Arrivalist, you have Uber Media, you have Placed and Placer, and lots of options out there. And so compared to 5 years ago, when it was a fairly expensive thing to take on, even smaller destinations now are finding that they can fit this into their budgets relatively easily. Economic impact and visitor spending. This is so critical. You need to pay attention to data that matters to your local government, your chambers, and local business owners. You want to be able to speak their language just as well as what we do currently as DMOs with our hoteliers. And you can't do that if you don't understand what people are spending and what the economic impact of that spending is. And I bring this up, and for a lot of you, this is going to be kind of a duh thing, but you should really be thinking about this. And for a lot of folks, they're either not doing it currently, or maybe they're doing it every 3 or 4 years. I'm a proponent of doing these types of studies every single year. And the reason for that is that so you have the data on hand to see it, to get a sense of the trending and see where you are now compared to 3 years ago. So I think that budgeting for this on a yearly basis has really become more and more important. And again, there are lots of providers out there that can do this work for you very cost efficiently. Lodging reports. We know Smith Travel Research. Most of us are probably are subscribing to Smith Travel Research, but short-term rental data has become really important in 2021. And for many, it's becoming the most important thing in 2021, especially for smaller rural destinations that depend more heavily on short-term rental like Airbnb than name brand hotels. Performance data and attribution. Hey, it's not all junk. We still have to operate without a cash register or without a point of conversion. So engagement and attribution metrics, from our media providers, our media partners, whoever you might be working with, is Sojourn or TripAdvisor or Expedia. The data that they're giving us is still pretty critical. As is, what information we're getting from places like Google and Google Analytics. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it has still got its place in 2021 for this data. You just want to think about, out of that particular set of information, what's really important to you and what's maybe not. And then finally, and this is really a new one, competitive intelligence and benchmarking. It's becoming really important to understand and learn from what our competitors and competitors are doing. Benchmarking on really widely accepted KPIs can be useful. Certainly Smith Travel Research has had a competitive data set report. I believe they have had available now for a long time. Companies like AirDNA also provide that point of view for the short-term rental market. And here at Madden, we also have some of that information on hand, like what folks are doing, in terms of paid media. SEO, SEM, there's lots of providers out there. Here at Madden, for our own platform, we use SEMrush, but there's Moz and lots of others out there so that you can also see how you're competing in the world of search. So 3 top takeaways here at the end. Number 1, destination intelligence to really help create and address key business questions that you have. It needs to be easy to communicate. It needs to scale appropriately to your needs. If you're a small rural DMO with 3 folks on your staff, you don't need $150,000 to solve your issues, most likely. Then again, maybe you do, but make sure that it's appropriate to what your actual needs are versus trying to take on too much. Next, consider whether your metrics pass the 3 A's test, and don't isolate them and don't allow them to become surrogates for your strategy. Your metric is not your strategy. Don't focus too much on just one thing, and you'll be far better for it. There's no one size fits all for what types of data and research you need. Hopefully that's become pretty clear here by the end of the presentation. There are a few things I do feel like location data, economic impact, lodging reports that are never going to go out of style. And here in 2021, I do feel like have become really must-haves for most DMOs. But again, go through those key business questions and decide for yourself whether or not even those things that I think are bedrock are necessarily something that you and your destination needs or your tourism business. So with that, we'll wrap up. I really sincerely appreciate all of you. As I've mentioned here at Madden, we certainly do have a platform called Voyage that takes into account a lot of what we've talked about today. But I do want to again make a very strong point that destination intelligence is not about a platform you have to go out and buy. It is really, as much as anything, about a mindset, about how you think about the data and the research that you're bringing in, and how you're using it, how you're reporting on it, how you're taking action on it. And that can be as simple as how you're organizing it in a spreadsheet or in a dashboard that you're building yourself, or simply just how you're reviewing it on a regular basis. So I wanted to make that point here at the end. We've got a few minutes left here in the hour, so if you have any questions, feel free to give me those, shoot those my way now. I'm gonna make it to where I can see you guys. You're all still here. I didn't have this open, so I was, this is the fear of anybody doing one of these presentations as you get to the end is, are they still here? And there's at least a few of you, so thank you for that. But happy to take any questions you have. Not all at once.
I'll ask a quick question maybe to get it going. That comp set or that competition metric as far as comparing how you're performing or how some of your initiatives are performing against others is really critical. I'm just wondering, how sophisticated is that process? Like, if you have the ability to compare to what some of your competitors are doing in the marketing space, how good is that information?
Well, it's gotten pretty darn good here lately. Certainly we've been able to get STR benchmarking reports for a long time. AirDNA and other short-term rental data partners are now making that available. Here at Madden, we've been using the SEMrush platform for a long time to understand the differences in performance for websites between, or just our SEO, SEM marketing. It's a great platform. We have it integrated into our Voyage platform, actually. Because we liked it that much. And it allows you to go in and say, okay, just as an example, where am I winning and where am I losing on keyword search? So, I'll use a Pennsylvania example. So, Gettysburg, a lot of pretty trees over there, fall foliage, I would imagine. If you went in there and said, okay, how are we doing when someone types in Pennsylvania fall foliage? Where do I rank on that search compared to Philadelphia? Or New York City. If New York City's beating me out on fall foliage, then I know that I got to get to work because, hey, I know I got prettier trees, right, than New York City in the fall. Just a fun example. I don't actually know anything about whether or not how you're comparing there, but it's that type of information. And I think for our clients at Madden, we've seen more and more of that. Now, we also do have the ability to pull in through another data provider a way to see paid media. Now, not paid media performance in what is how's Carl's click-through rates on his ads doing compared to mine, Jared, but rather what types of media are they running? What does their creative look like? How much are they investing in, and what times of the year? And then finally, something that's relatively new that we've been working on here as well is the utilization of geolocation data. So it is now possible to actually use polygons to view visitation into competing destinations. To give you an example, we just completed a project for Port Aransas, Texas, where we looked at and polygoned several destinations along the Gulf Coast of Florida and Texas. And we could see, for them, it was a specific question. They said, we want to know what times of the year people from Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin, which are their big 4 key markets, are going to Destin and Gulf Shores and places in Florida. And what they learned was that it's not happening in spring break. They're winning that war 10-1. People from those markets are coming down in droves to Port Aransas in the spring, but quite a few of them are going to Destin in the summertime. And so in that regard, they've learned that if we're going to do a campaign that specifically targets people who are likely to go to Florida, we need to be thinking about the summer months in Q3 rather than spring break. So there's a lot out there and more every day that's being made available and is more cost efficient than you might think. So it is leaps and bounds ahead of where we were even just a few years ago with what's available to us. Well, if there are no further questions, I think we're going to end right on time. Again, sincere thank you to all of you. Thank you to Katie Berger, one of your own there in Lehigh Valley, for organizing this. It is a real pleasure. If you have any follow-up questions, if you'd like to learn more about what we're doing with Voyage, we're happy to have that conversation. But I do hope that you were able to take something from this. We'll make this deck available to you. And have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.